Hello. Let me start today's joint event of Free Russia Foundation, PEN America, PEN Ukraine, and Media Initiative for Human Rights, devoted to freedom of expression in Crimea and international efforts in its support. My name is Natalia Arno. I'm president of Free Russia Foundation. We coordinate efforts of pro-democracy Russians to push for positive changes in our home country. We assist Russian civil society and independent media. We help formulate strategy on Russia in the West, and we inform global audiences about what's going on in our home country. Basically, we fight for a free Russia, and we want our home country to be a normal, civilized global citizen. Free Russia Foundation has many initiatives, and one of our key programs is an advocacy campaign for the release of Kremlin's political prisoners, including Ukrainian hostages of the Kremlin, including Crimean Tatars and citizens of Russia-occupied Crimea. Besides our advocacy campaign that we conduct together with many partner human rights organizations, including Ukrainian partners, for example, Center for Civil Liberties, we also provide assistance with litigation inside Russia or on Russia-occupied territories. We help with prison visits, capacity building for associations, helping political prisoners. And we also, sorry, it's a very emotional subject for me. We also spearhead legal processes at international institutions. For example, last year, we submitted an Article 15 communication to the International Criminal Court, an 84-page document specifying the circumstances of crimes against Crimean citizens. Last December, together with the Media Initiative for Human Rights, we made a submission of global Magnitsky sanctions. And I'm sure that today's panelist, Maria, will talk more about this. And while we really applaud the US decision to include Leonid Mikhailuk, the head of Crimean Federal Security Services, to this global Magnitsky sanctions list, there were also many more names on this submission, and we hope the US authorities will consider all of them. One of the consequences of the Crimean annexation, of the Kremlin's annexation of Crimea brought to the peninsula is a ruthless curtailing of freedom of expression. And during all these 7 years of occupation, journalists, bloggers, freedom fighters, human rights defenders are under attack. So today, on this sad anniversary of deportation of Crimean Tatars, the subject of our discussion is still very urgent and relevant. And I thank all of our partners for co-organizing this event. Let me introduce the moderator of today's panel, Polina Sadovskaya, PEN America first free expression programs coordinator for Eurasia. Prior to that, Polina was with UNESCO's Division of Freedom of Expression and Media Development, worked for Habitat Pro Association, and was a radio correspondent. Polina, thank you for this idea of today's event and of the event last year. So we actually can say that it's an annual event. So the floor over to you. Thank you.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Natalia. And thank you to all our partners, Free Russia Foundation, PEN Ukraine, Media Initiative for Human Rights, to help us organize this event. So yes, indeed, it became a tradition that PEN America, together with Free Russia Foundation, organized an event on Crimea around mid-May to commemorate the deportation of Crimean Tatars under Stalin rule, to talk about the similarities with the current hardship of Crimean Tatars under Russians, and to shine light on incessant persecution of journalists, bloggers, and writers who work in the area and tell the truth about what's happening to the world. So today, after 7 years since Russia took over Crimea, we convene again to hear from First, Nariman Memedeminov, a Crimean Tatar blogger and activist who spent 2.5 years in Russian penal colony on charges of terrorism, typically used by Russians towards those who speak up. Jamie Fly, president of RFERL, who recently came back to this post after domestic attacks on the media and now has to deal with the Kremlin threats that seriously undermine the ability of RFERL to gather news in Russia. Maria Tomak, the founder of Ukrainian Organization of Media Initiative for Human Rights, whose tireless advocacy on sanctioning individuals responsible for human rights abuses in Crimea is very well known, as Natalia already mentioned. You'll hear from all of them today, but we'll start with the president of PEN Ukraine, the wonderful, well-known writer Andrei Kurkov. Before I will ask my first question, I just would like to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session in the end. You can use the chat function to write down all your questions and we will be able to answer them later. So, Andrei, it's been 7 years since the occupation of Crimea by Russia. Can you please give us an overview? What has changed since then for Ukrainian people, for free expression in the region? How do you see this?
Good afternoon or good morning. I don't know where everybody is. I know where Nariman is at the moment, but I first want to recollect January 2014. This was the moment after New Year celebration when my family went last time to the Crimea. We had this tradition with kids to go to Sevastopol or to Faros or to Gorzów for winter holidays. And already in January 2014, there were lots of Russian banners in Sevastopol and lots of minibuses and cars with logo of United Russia Party and with other organizations which were feeling very free on Crimean territory and were much more active than a foreign organization could be. And then in March, Crimea was annexed. Since then, lots of things happened, and I cannot tell you about any, even one positive change. You cannot have positive changes in the territory in the peninsula, which is annexed, and the new power is introducing its own rules, its own censorship, and its own history and narrative. And since 2014, we observed not only repressions against journalists, against activists, against anybody who was not accepting annexation and was just voicing against it, but we noticed that there were geopolitical processes started by Russian Federation, where probably hundreds of thousands of people from Russia moved, resettled to Crimea in order to make this discontented part of the population less heard and smaller. And of course, the first victims and the main victims of this annexation are Crimean Tatars, who were already deported once and had to stay decades outside of their motherland. Then they came back and they face until today very difficult situation when they are minority, but they are active minority and they are mistreated just because of their history and their attitude. They don't want to be lost in their own Crimea. They don't want to be unseen, made unheard. The situation with mass media in Crimea probably reflects the Russian policy the best way, because even after annexation, for example, Ukrainian journalists could go and cover the events and tell the Ukrainian audience what is happening there. Crimean journalists were working also trying to show the real picture of the events, but slowly, or maybe not so slowly, the independent mass media, where mass media was shut down, was destroyed. 10 Crimean mass media outlets were actually had to move out of Crimea. So all the collectives, all the groups of journalists working for websites and newspapers, they went to mainland Ukraine and continued working from Ukraine proper. Those who remained had to face charges of terrorism, imprisonment, detainment, and harassment. And some of them were arrested, like Mykola Semena, and then they were exchanged for pro-Russian separatists. Some of them actually are still in prisons, but the events that continued, especially the repressions against Crimean Tatars, they forced people with no education, with no experience, to become civil journalists. And these were the people who were attending searches and court hearings, streaming what was happening, actually writing, taking photos. And they became the next target of a Russian repressive machine. 8 of civil journalists are detained now, imprisoned for their activities. And what is happening next, the whole system is organized in such a way that if you are trying to help somebody who is arrested in Crimea because of their political attitude, you are financing terrorism. So, I mean, this conveyor is launched. And so, I mean, if somebody is detained and arrested and 5 or 7 people, including family members, are helping the arrested person, they are financing terrorism. I want to say also that Ukrainian journalists were banned from attending Crimea. And one of them, Taras Ibragimov, received 35 years ban. So practically, Russia is trying to cut any source of information coming from Crimea about real state of affairs. But we still have new civil journalists which are replacing those who are arrested. And thanks to them, probably this is the only possibility for us to find out what is happening. It's not the fact that actually something new is happening, but there are new victims and new arrests and new harassments and searches. And recently, Ukrainian journalist working for Radio Free Europe, Vladimir Yesipenko, was arrested and also charged with terrorism. So it is a dangerous and it is a difficult zone if you want to work, if you want to tell the truth, what is happening. But there are people who are ready to take risks for the sake of truth to become known outside Crimea. At the moment, 99 Ukrainian citizens from Crimea are detained, arrested, and sentenced and spending their terms in different Russian colonies and prisons. 76 of them are Crimean Tatars. The number of detained awaiting actually court hearings is changing every day, but it is not diminishing, it's becoming actually bigger. So the situation is going to become more serious issue for anybody who cares about human rights abuses in the world. The term civil journalist is used not only regarding Crimean activists who are trying to share information about what is happening in Crimea, but also is used for the civil journalists who are now working in Myanmar. It's not a very nice parallel. I mean, there are 2 points, 2 places in the world where the information comes out only thanks to civil journalists. And I think we should remember this and we should help them whenever we can. Thank you very much, Polina.
Thank you, Andrei, and thank you for giving us this idea of how the movement of civil journalists look like in Crimea. Also, thank you for mentioning the case of Ladislav Yesipenko. We're going to talk about him later. But first, I want to go back to the civil journalism movement and turn it over to Nariman right now. Nariman, you co-founded Crimean Solidarity platform movement, and you were responsible specifically about its information flow. So can you tell us more about the movement from your perspective and your story yourself? Can you tell us what happened?
Okay, good morning. First, как я и говорил, my English so very bad, поэтому нужно помогать мне в переводе. My speech, I write my speech, so I easy read my speech. But if you won't tell me some answer, для того, чтобы мне отвечать, нужно будет, чтобы мне кто-то помогал переводить. Вот скажите об этом, пожалуйста.
So Nariman is just saying that his English is probably not perfect. He prepared his speech, wrote it down, and he will share his thoughts just by reading it. But we will help him, of course, later on when he will be speaking Russian and will be translating. So just be ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I begin. After my family returned from the places of deportation, I have been living in Crimea since 1992. My specializing is international economics from Ternopil National Economic University. Civic journalism for me was spontaneous because the searches and arrests of Crimean Tatar, Crimean Muslims were not covered. I have been publishing posts on social media since mid-2014. It was time when certain so-called extremists and terrorists suddenly appeared in Crimea, and the Crimean Tatars turned overnight into extremists and terrorists. The first high-profile case that I covered was the case of the Crimean Tatars from Sevastopol, Nuri Primov, Ferhat Seyfullayev, Rustem Vaitov, and Ruslan Zeytullayev. Then the Crimean Solidarity Association was established, where I was a media coordinator. This activity, which covered persecution, politically motivated cases, life of families of political prisoners, was necessary because professional media do not work in Crimea anymore, of course, not by their own choice. Russian special services searched my house when I lived with my wife and 3 young children twice, in 2016 and 2018. After a search on 22 of March 2018, I was arrested and accused of publicly calling for terrorist activities. Then reason for arrest were several videos I shot in 2013. I did not admit my guilt because, of course, I haven't made any calls to carry out terrorist activities in principle. Such calls of activities contradict my life views, contradict the Crimean Tatars culture, which comes from the Islam religion. On 21 of September 2020, after 2 years and 6 months of imprisonment, I was released and returned to my native Crimea, to my family and loved ones, to my people. Now, I did not have any social media accounts due to the ban of such activities. Doing journalism is not possible. But everyone knows that today Marlen Asanov, Server Mustafayev, Osman Arif Memetov, Remzi Bekirov, Timur Ibragimov, Seyran Saliyev, Ruslan Suleimanov, and many other journalists remain in prison. For many objective journalists banned entry in Crimea, so they can't work there. It is well known that since early 2021, there have already been arrests. The pressure of the Crimean Tatar Muslims people continues. However, if professional journalists and media show solidarity with civic journalists from Crimea. If independent and objective journalists make trips to Crimea, of course, according to Ukrainian legislation, organize information campaigns, if journalists and diplomats visit courts in Rostov-on-Don, it will be even better and more efficient. If various human rights organizations, politicians, international organizations cover more broadly and massively what is happening with activists and civic journalists in Crimea, if they continue to carry out effective and purposeful actions that will be aimed at the release of political prisoners, then we will certainly reach success. I'm all.
Thank you, Nariman. That was really helpful, and we will again come back to the actions that we can do as international community to try and change the situation. But my next question is to Jamie now. Jamie, you're a president of RFERL. RFERL's journalists, like civic journalists from Crimean Solidarity, also work in the area in very dangerous conditions that can let them end up in prison for just doing their job. So can you tell us more about those conditions and the exact cases of persecutions of RFERL journalists like Vladislav Yesipenko, who was mentioned earlier?
Sure, thanks, Paulina. Thanks for including me, and thanks to PEN America for hosting all of us today. I think it's an incredibly important topic to talk about the bravery we see from journalists who are willing to take risks to report from inside Crimea. And for us at RFERL, this conversation comes at an important time because we've seen the Russian Federation cracking down on independent media throughout Russia. And as I was reflecting on this topic in preparation for today, looking at our experience in Crimea over the last 7 years, I think, unfortunately, we see the challenges and the difficult operating environment that has existed in Crimea over the last 7 years now being transferred to Russia writ large. And the risks that journalists have had to take for a long time in Crimea are now being shared, unfortunately, in Russia. And I think, if anything, perhaps the Kremlin and Russian state institutions perhaps were trying out certain methods of information control and repression in Crimea that they're now applying elsewhere. We've seen them target journalists using the judicial system and the legal system, branding journalists as spies and foreign agents in Crimea. We now see that same sort of rhetoric being used across Russia. And RFERL journalists have been on the front lines of all of this. A little background about what we've been doing over the last 7 years in Crimea. Our Ukrainian service, within 3 months of the 2014 Russian annexation, launched Crim Reality, a website which is dedicated to developments inside of Crimea, and it's published in Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar. It's developed into a respected and popular source for news and information about Crimea, and it produces, in addition to the online content, radio and video programming. And that platform, Crim Reality, even though it's been operated by our Ukrainian service and includes staffers based in Kyiv, was designated a foreign agent media outlet like many of RFERL's Russian platforms by the Russian Justice Ministry in 2017. The Russian authorities on the peninsula have also used what are, quite frankly, Cold War style tactics to try to block our ability to reach the Crimean audience. They've even resorted to jamming our radio frequencies, which is something that the company is very familiar with from its decades long ago past during the Cold War. But despite these efforts by the authorities to block our access to the audience, we've persisted and we've used many contributors who have been reporting from inside Crimea. Now, they've faced significant pressure and threats. Many have to work under pseudonyms, and we often have to bring on guests for interviews and on-air commentary who cannot give their real names. And even our staff in Kyiv, who are physically removed from Crimea but are still working on this project, have faced horrible harassment targeted at them online, some of it aimed at them personally, including threats against their physical safety. One of these employees, one of our former social media editors from the Ukrainian service, Olena Dub, was actually harassed extensively even after she left working for RFERL, all because of her work aimed at providing news and information to the Crimean audience. Our contributors are often barred from entering Crimea by the Russian authorities. And some of our colleagues who have run afoul of the authorities were already mentioned. Mykola Semena became a face of the Russian efforts to silence independent media in Crimea. He was found guilty of separatism in 2016. He was banned from journalism up until 2020, when he was finally allowed to leave Crimea for mainland Ukraine. And his saga was a horrible one for years, not being able to practice journalism, a career that he loved. More recently, just several months ago, one of our contributors for Crimea Realities, Vladislav Yaspenko, who was also mentioned, was detained while in Crimea. He was completing an assignment to report on an event honoring Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko. And he testified several weeks after his detention that he had been tortured for 2 days with electric shocks, beatings, and threatened with death by agents of the FSB unless he confessed to spying on behalf of Ukraine. He was also accused of supposedly having a weapon in his car, which was patently false. And he remains in prison in Crimea, and he's being held in pretrial detention. So these are the sorts of examples of brave journalists who have been just trying to report about what is going on inside Crimea, and they're basically treated as spies, as foreign agents, as criminals, and even the authorities go to such lengths as torture to try to persecute these individuals. I'll just conclude by noting what I said at the outset, that unfortunately these sorts of travails that journalists experience inside Crimea are now being experienced by more and more journalists across Russia. And RFERL is also facing significant challenges. Our bureau in Moscow is under threat of closure. Our bank accounts were actually just frozen on Friday, all because of the Kremlin's efforts to deem independent media that rely on foreign funding as foreign agents. And so they're applying a lot of the same rhetoric, the same threats now to independent media across Russia. And I should note that the invasive labeling that's been demanded of RFERL, because Crim Reality was designated a foreign agent, has been demanded of that platform as well. And so despite these challenges that we face inside Russia, in Russian annexed Crimea, we're going to continue to make sure that we can report from inside Crimea about what's going on, but also try to get objective news and information to a Crimean audience. Despite the Kremlin's efforts, we're going to redouble our efforts and make sure that we're still there for our audience during this time when they need access to information the most.
Thank you, Jamie. And let me express enormous gratitude and respect to all the RFERL journalists and top management for everything what you guys are going through right now. Now I want to turn it over to Maria. Maria, you do a lot of work to keep Crimea on the international agenda. Recently, you joined Crimean Platform on the civil society side. So can you tell us a little bit about the Crimean Platform, but also how the international community reacts to the Crimean issue right now, compared to the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and what could be done more?
Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everyone. Thank you for having me, and we are very glad to co-organize this important event jointly with our colleagues from the US. And I represent the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and we work with a range of issues related to the consequences of the armed conflict, basically Russian aggression in Ukraine, including Crimean issues and including the international advocacy. And I see that there's not so many people who joined us today, but I believe it may be considered as a good sign as well, because there were a lot of events dedicated to Crimea recently, in the recent month and even weeks. We have the new ambassador to the US, and we had like recently a delegation coming to US with the agenda including Crimea. So, and I think this raise of the interest is interlinked, is related, first of all, to this new initiative launched by Ukraine, is Crimean Platform that Polina has mentioned. Just to be clear about my role and the role of the civil society, we are kind of trying to create a parallel expert community which would support this governmental dimension, I would say. But for us, it's very important that we stay kind of independent and we don't associate ourselves with the government, although clearly we have the same goals, is the occupation of Crimea and the territorial integrity of Ukraine and preserving of human rights and rule of law and international law. But we actually try to establish these connections within Ukrainian civil society and expert community, which is already there, but also with the international community and with the international experts that support this idea and that can join and kind of assist and support this whole idea with their expertise and maybe with some common projects, etc. And I would say that, I mean, it's obvious for all of us that there was a very clear decline of the interest towards Crimea in the recent years. But okay, 7 years have passed and it's like, it's a lot of time, and the world constantly like faces new threats, and I would say it's something normal probably, and it's something usual that this issue was to the big extent forgotten. But of course, it's also a consequence of the very active Russian efforts. And I would like to quote here the Russian representative at the UN, who said recently during one of the events at the UN dedicated to Crimea that Crimea is a closed issue. But I believe that our event today and the whole idea of the Crimean Platform and the fact that it's supported by the US government, but also non-governmental organizations, shows that Crimea is not a closed issue. And I think that's one of the main purposes of the Crimean Platform, is to make it not a closed issue. And actually, speaking more about this expert community and Crimean Platform, it will all be opened and launched in summer of this year. There will be an inauguration summit, which is organized by the government, but also we will organize our small forum as a civil society also to launch this expert network of the Crimean Platform. And I should say that, I mean, to be very honest and clear, and that's one of the reasons why the Crimean Platform is important, is again, due to some misinformation and efforts taken by the Russian government. And I think that's very clear, and everyone can see that. I mean, we can consider a kind of hesitancy from the side of some of the experts or civil society actors when it comes to calling the Crimea an occupied area. We have the UNGA resolutions clearly saying that Crimea is an occupied area. We even have this established legal fact established by the European Court for Human Rights. I understand that it's not so relevant for the US context, but for the European context is very much relevant. And it's a very serious statement from the ECHR that Crimea de facto is an occupied area, is under the effective control of the Russian Federation. But what I see at the level of the expert community, that not always people are ready to say that it's occupied, pretending that it's a political issue. It's not a political issue, it's a legal issue. And I think it's very important to acknowledge and to understand. And I think to everyone who has this intellectual courage to recognize that Crimea is an occupied area. And of course, it's not only the matter of how we call it, it's the matter of who is responsible and who has to be kind of persecuted in future, I hope, by the International Criminal Court and other institutions for the crimes that are committed, including the persecution of the journalists. And maybe last point that I would like to underline is the issue of sanctions. And this issue is very important in the context of the Crimean platform for us as civil society, but also it's proclaimed as one of the priorities by the Ukrainian government. And here we can say that we have a small success story with our submission filed jointly with the Free Russia Foundation and Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, being kind of supported in some of the aspects, right, by adding to the sanctions list Mr. Mikhailuk, the head of the FSB in Crimea. And I have to say that we will continue that effort. We will make submissions related to Donbass, I believe. I hope so, but I have to say that it's very challenging to compile this list on Donbass. It's much more challenging because of the unclear structure and chain of command, but it's probably a separate issue. But however, the role of the civil society in this sanctions process is very important at the international level, but also for Ukraine. And for us, what is very important, it's not so, again, relevant for the US, where this compliance mechanism is very strong and the monitoring of the sanctions, compliance with the sanctions is very serious, and there can be serious consequences for those who violate the sanctions regime. But it's not as much serious for the EU member states. And we have seen cases of the violations of sanctions and all of these schemes related to how to avoid sanctions. And I think that that will be one of the priorities as well for the Crimean platform, how to make the system more resilient and prevent it from this fraud, I would say. And sanctions are also important in the internal Ukrainian context. As a civil society representative, I cannot help but say that Ukraine has lots of work to do internally. I mean, the amendments to the sanctions legislations, which is really, really weak. And as we learned from recent tapping published by some of the Ukrainian Secret Service, I believe that these drawbacks of the current legislations on sanctions in Ukraine allowed to weaken sanctions by the previous presidential administration on the request from the Russian side. So again, it's a separate story, but I think that our legislation has to be improved before the Crimean platform. And it also comes, and it also important, this internal homework when it comes to the law on the political prisoners and their social support, which is not yet adopted, and which is very important for us and for our partners, like Association of the relatives of the political prisoners, and who will insist that this legislation is adopted before the Crimean platform, when we have so much attention and so much kind of noise around all this issue. Probably I will stop here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that our audience has a chance to ask all the questions. So please, if you have any questions to any of our participants, drop it in the chat, and we'll read it and try to answer it. Administrators, please help me if I don't see them, because I currently don't see them. So while you're thinking about the questions, I'll probably ask one more of mine. So thank you, Maria. And I hear already some of the kind of like requests for the international actions and what international community can do from your speech. I'm a little bit disagree with you on the importance of the language. I think it is important how we call it. And as a representative of literary organizations specifically, and I hope Andrei will agree with me, yes, it is important to call it how it is, occupied territory. I also hear from Nariman some actions that we can do and the international community can do, such as all the diplomats and opinion leaders going there, going to where they can to meet with people, to speak with them, to raise the issue, to go to Rostov-on-Don, to kind of be present and show to the international community their solidarity. So what else? Can you just maybe reflect on the actual steps that we as international community can do to deal with all these issues?
Thank you. It's an important question, and it really depends also on whom we refer to, kind of, because we have the US, we have the EU, and I believe that these kind of requests and recommendations are a little bit different. And but also I wanted to underline this idea, but I missed it, and it's very important. I believe that to the big extent, how active is the international community depends on us, on Ukraine. Because I'm sure that we would not have had all this rumor and all this kind of noise around Crimea that we have now if there will be no this initiative on Crimean platform. So so that's why I think it's very important to kind of to have these recommendations ready and requirements ready. And when it comes to EU, I believe that, from my human rights perspective, that we are all waiting that EU will establish personal sanctions against those who committed human rights violations in Crimea and in Donbass, according to the recently adopted legislations on human rights sanctions. It was adopted in the end of the previous year. Of course, we hope that there will be new sanctions from the side of the US. And it's not, it's obvious that the US sanctions are the strongest ones. And we're always interested, though, that as many people as it's possible and entities as it's possible are sanctioned when it comes to both Crimea and Donbass. And maybe I will elaborate a little bit more on this, why it's so complicated when it comes to Donbass, because we were kind of proclaiming a long time ago that we would like to prepare the sanctions list. But in Crimea, we have the recognized by Russia. Russia recognizes that it controls Crimea, and we have all this chain of command very clear. You can find it on the website, who is the head of the FSB, who is the head of the Ministry of Interior, etc. When it comes to Donbass, it's a totally different situation, and it's really hard to understand who is responsible for what. And especially when it comes to tortures, because these people, they don't introduce themselves normally. So that's why it's more complicated. But I believe that now we have the current US administration is very, pays lots of attention to Ukraine. And it's up to Ukraine to use this chance to kind of move forward Ukrainian agenda, and in particular this non-recognition, so-called non-recognition policy, non-recognition meaning the Crimean annexation. And also I think that when it comes again to Crimean platform, I think it's an important place to introduce to the international community our vision of the deoccupation process of Crimea, because it's not, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. You have like the amnesty question, you have the question of the decolonization, because I would like to, I mean, to emphasize that there's a huge problem with the colonization of Crimea, because people from the Russian Federation are brought deliberately to Crimea in order to, to colonize it, basically. And those who are not loyal to Russian Federation, they are kind of squeezed out from Crimea or arrested or persecuted. So you have this changing demographic situation, and it's a huge question in terms of human rights and international law, how to act properly after the Crimea is deoccupied, and what do you do with all those people? And these questions are not yet resolved by Ukraine, even inside our country and by our state. And I think that it's important to elaborate this vision and to introduce it to the international community, and to make sure that we have this support from the international community, and that as soon as it's possible, Ukraine will implement this plan with the support of our international partners, because I believe that otherwise we will not be able to deal with these problems by ourselves.
Thank you. Jamie, Andrei, Nariman.
Sure. As the head of a news organization, I usually stay out of policy recommendations, but I'll just say, if you look at the situation that Ukraine in particular has faced in the last decade, I think far too often Washington, European capitals have ignored Russia's hybrid warfare against Ukraine in all forms. And as I mentioned in this case with the attacks on journalists just trying to report information from inside Crimea, the record time and time again is that Russia has tested methods in various parts of Ukraine that they then end up applying elsewhere, including in Western Europe, including in the United States. And so I think from a US perspective, it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about what's going on in Crimea today, the methods that are being used. And that leads you down a path, if you recognize that history, of governments needing to act more quickly to support Ukraine, to pursue all tools at their disposal. So I think I just want to make that broad point. On journalism in particular, I just say, and this is a challenge in Crimea, but quite frankly, across Eurasia, the US and Europe should work more closely together to coordinate their support for independent media. That's certainly a need in Crimea. And support is not just funding. It's not just speaking out when journalists are under pressure and are facing horrible attacks and literally torture, as I described in Vladislav Yaspenko's case. But it's also helping with creative solutions to some of the issues I raised about Kremlin attempts to block access to the audience. When we see jamming of frequencies, there are ways that governments can work together to help news organizations circumvent those efforts to block information. And so I think there are all kinds of creative ways that we could see this rise on the transatlantic agenda to really be an initiative where we could see more cooperation between the United States and Europe in support of independent media and a coordinated response to this constant Kremlin attack on freedom of the press and on efforts to just promote the truth about what is happening on a territory that they claim to control. I think we need to see more transatlantic conversation about this rather than individual countries pursuing their own solutions.
Thank you. Andrei, you also wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that actually before annexation, I would say photos or posters representing Crimea would have palaces, royal palaces, and architectural miracles of this peninsula. And since annexation, actually, Crimea is represented with by photos of imprisoned civil journalists and activists. And I think Ukraine should do also more to profile these cases inside the country. I mean, we have articles, we have, we have a lot of information about the situation with political freedoms in Crimea, but we could have had much more on TV, on radio, and the names and the faces of these people who are imprisoned and detained should become familiar to average Ukrainian before they become familiar to average European or American. I mean, they should be present at the photos of these people and their biography should be present at the international conferences everywhere. I mean, we should do much more to promote their cases, not to promote, but to show, and to show also that we are not going to forget about it, especially since we know that the number of detained people will grow until either the world community will force Russia to stop and to release detained people and arrested people and to accept that the annexation was unlawful, or the world will be just tired of this information and the situation will be forgotten. And we cannot afford to let the situation in Crimea to get forgotten by the world community.
That's right. So before
Алина, простите.
Да.
Вопрос, который вы задавали, можете буквально вот 2 фразы, ну, чтобы я уточнил, правильно ли я его понял, перевести?
Конечно. I'm just, before we end our conversation, which is coming to an end, I want to give Nariman also the chance to answer this question, and I'm just going to translate from Russian. Nariman, so, мы обсуждаем конкретные действия, которые международное сообщество может предпринять, чтобы решить проблемы, о которых мы сегодня говорили.
Ну, тогда буквально 2 фразы. Вот, ну, сегодня время такое, время параллелей. Вот даже Андрей говорил, хоть это и прискорбно, но тем не менее, там, да, какую-то работу в Крыму приходится вот представлять, как в Мьянме, да, вот, скажем, из-за того, что там нет вообще в принципе, наверное, из-за ситуации каких-то медиа, которые могли бы что-то там сказать, там работают исключительно люди, которые вот с телефонами, и мы их сегодня, вот это явление, гражданская журналистика, ну, наверное, во всех уголках мира, тем более в Мьянме, вот это вот параллель. Так вот, я что хочу сказать, если вот зверства, которые происходили в 30-х, скажем, да, годах в Советском Союзе, ну, об этом в мире могли не знать, потому что занавес, скажем, сложный доступ к информации и так далее и тому подобное, то сегодня, извините, 21 век, который называют миром, вернее, веком, ну, информационным, веком информации. Если сегодня происходящее, вот подобное происходящее в Крыму, в том числе, я имею в виду, будет происходить с молчаливого согласия, а иначе просто не объективно, можно именно так сказать, что происходящее происходит с молчаливого согласия мирового сообщества. Я понимаю, что это не так, но тем не менее, если подходить к этому вопросу не объективно, то у людей, тем более живущих на подобных территориях, где живу я, ну, например, в Крыму, да, либо там будет это Донбасс, либо что-то другое, но ограничимся вот этими 2. Необъективно подходя, они могут подумать, происходящее происходит, ситуация с молчаливого согласия мирового сообщества, то есть, ну, никак мировое сообщество не может повлиять на эту ситуацию, тем более я, тем более мы, люди и так далее, да? Вот. И будет, ну, какое-то состояние, какое-то положение безнадежности. Так вот, вот все, о чем говорилось, это на самом деле, ну, вот действенные шаги, которые бы могли приводить к положительным, да, к результатам, которые будут, ну, олицетворять в себе справедливость. Поэтому, ну, это очень важно. Вот еще раз большое спасибо всем участникам, потому что вот даже подобное что-то, пусть это онлайн, пусть это не личные какие-то встречи, не выезды, но тем не менее это важно. Мы об этом говорим. Если говорим мы, соответственно, увидят другие, наше окружение. Ну и тем более, если мы это будем говорить на каких-то встречах с участием, скажем, членами международных организаций, то это будет только хорошо, это будет отлично, это приведет, даст Бог, к очень нужным результатам. Поэтому сегодня вот у людей, как минимум, живущих вот в таком положении, на таких территориях, не должно складываться впечатление, что происходящее вот имеет место быть с молчаливого согласия международного сообщества.
Спасибо. Сейчас попытаюсь перевести. The important point that Nariman is making is that we are commemorating the date when of the deportation of Crimean Tatars by under Stalin rule. But that was 30s in 20th century, and there were many reasons why the information flow wasn't so spread. Now we cannot afford that the situation that is happening in Crimea with free expression, with human rights in general, is not discussed and not known for the international community. We cannot afford that these atrocities are still happening without international community talking about it constantly. So it is incredibly important to keep this on the top of the agenda in the international community, and even events like today is something important that makes Crimean people also hope that eventually this situation will be coming to an end. And that's what's a major thing that Nariman is stressing. Nariman, вы сказали какие-то две вещи, да? Еще что-то вы хотели сказать? Основное, да. Yes, and this is a positive note in a way, even though we are talking about very lots of problems that are happening, but without hope, no changes can be happening. So I'm glad that we are finishing our event on this note, and I would like to thank all our speakers and make sure that you and also all our audience who joined us today, and make sure that we all follow what is happening in Crimea and the developments of the Crimean platform and the situation with the journalists in the region. Please follow, share, spread the information, and keep it on the top of the agenda. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.